My name is Patrick McFadin. I work for DataStax. I'm also an Apache Cassandra committer. Been working on data and databases.
All right, your turn.
I'm Yi. LlamaIndex is I joined LlamaIndex 3 months ago. LlamaIndex is an open source tool to do LM orchestration, primarily getting your data into the LMs.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a not coder here, a technical product manager.
Yeah. I'm Ryan, I just spoke, but yeah, I'm working on the Kaskada project. I'm one of the creators and excited to be talking about open source.
Great. Well, let's talk about the importance of open data. So, Ryan, you were mentioning before that access to trained weights is an improvement, and let's talk about the importance and what that means.
Yeah, I think this is something that's really, really interesting and somewhat new. I think that we've been talking about open source as a development methodology for a long time, right? The Linux was probably one of the first really interesting kind of byproducts of this cathedral versus the bazaar approach. But I think what's different about what's happening right now in the AI space is that the code doesn't really matter all that much. The code is fairly well understood and everyone's using the same code. It's all transformers, right? What really differentiates one model from another or one provider from another is generally what are the weights? How were they trained? What is the hardware that it's running on? And I think that we kind of need to think a little bit differently in an AI world about what it means to be open and to have an open development process. And I think that it's important to kind of have that in the conversation. And I think there's probably some things we need to think about around how are we sharing the data sets that we're working with. I think Hugging Face has been really helpful with this. But also, how are we sharing the transformations? So just having access to like the scrape of the internet is one thing, but being able to understand how are these data sets being processed, how are they being filtered, what kind of quality regimes are being put in place, what sort of human feedback is being used for the RLH, reinforcement learning from human feedback techniques are being used. And I think that this is really critical and that there's a need for conversation about this as well as tooling to be able to share this information. So that's kind of something I'm interested in. I don't know if there's anyone else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So can I jump in and just disagree with you?
Sure, bring it on.
Is that,
that'd be fun.
So
I'm gonna go after that. I'll disagree with you.
Okay, so I think all of the development in the open source AI models is great. And I think there is a trend towards increased openness, right? We went from we started with very open models to then going to completely closed models and then going to open but not available for commercial use. And now we're seeing models that are open and available for commercial use. And that, open weights, I should be more clear.
Yes.
And I think that's great. But where I would disagree is actually I think a lot, even in the most open weight model today, the building process of that model, the training process, the data that comes in, the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure for building that model, all of that today for all of these models is not open source. So if Stallman were sitting up here, he'd be like, these are all, non-free models. He'd be like, you guys are all betting your future on these things that are non-free because you cannot go and replicate the creation of one of these models. So I think that would be like sort of like that next step of openness would be to say, build me a top of the line model, show me the weights, but also show me every single thing that you did to actually get to that model. Yeah, no,
that's exactly, yes, I agree. That's what I'm saying I think we need more of. So
That's the secret sauce of that, right?
Yeah, and nobody wants to give it up.
No, of course not. Well, and there's probably, for the foundation models, I'm not going to go train a foundation model. I'm not going to go train Llama 2 because I don't have $100 million and 1,000 A100 sitting around. But I think that what we've seen is that for like Vicuña and Alpaca and all of these kind of models that were fine-tuned on top of the original Llama model, like this is producing really interesting innovation. And even in that case, I think we need to be, like, that's where this starts to provide value, is when we can start to have people building on the work of others and, you know, reusing the work of how they're producing the training data sets. So,
Well, I'm going to say this is probably the first time that if you want to use open, it's impossible. Because no one has the resources to pull this off. And so that's a real problem. I mean, the Replit folks, you know, they're talking about their LLMs not in terms of, you know, so much, they'll tell you where they got their data. So it's more of like a, you know, where are, like a software bill of materials, and here's our sources of data, and here's, you know, showing some trust in the data, but no one has the ability to create these unless you've got a few $1 million stashed away. I mean, this is kind of an interesting problem.
I feel like, okay, so the data is always there, but the way how you train it, how you see the data is always different, right? Whether it's in the AI edge or before. So the problem is always there.
But yeah, and I think people are holding stuff back. Like even in the papers, I think there's like things where it's like, yeah, we published this paper about, you know, Mistral, but is Mistral really giving us that secret sauce? I'm not sure they are, right? Like,
well, what is the secret sauce though? I mean, it's like no one's going to be able to reproduce Google search. Why? It's not because you don't have the technology to do it. It's you don't have the capacity. It's a volume problem, right? And that requires a lot of capital. But I think just kind of flipping it around, it's like this: what is open now in AI? And it's clearly not OpenAI. They started out that direction, and boy, they're just like, oh, never mind. But this will be interesting. Like you mentioned, Stallman. I mean, this is not the Free Software Foundation version of anything. Yeah. So now what?
Well, I think to your question about like what is the secret sauce in a sense now, and I think what's really interesting is that I think that it's the user feedback to using these tools that is going to be the really foundational competitive distinction between like OpenAI right now, is that they have a year's worth of people saying like this is a good or a bad response.
Right, absolutely. I think it's also unlocked new use case, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
and like going to sort of what we're working on, right? Like what all of us are working on. All the application side is open. So like you got this like sort of like foundation. It's almost going back to Microsoft days, right? You got the OS that's closed, and then everything on top of it, like people are sharing. You know, whether that's back in the day shareware, but now it's like all, and it's extremely open. Now it's all like MIT licensed, generally speaking. So.
This might lead to, Patrick, what you were talking about before, like clearing the confusion about licensing.
Yeah, you mentioned MIT license. It's funny because back in the day with OSCON, anyone remember OSCON? It was a great conference. Pour one out. This was a talk I used to give every OSCON, was a non-lawyer's view or an open source view of licensing. And like, how do you license an open source project and what does it actually mean? And you know, you mentioned MIT license, which is pretty much YOLO. Here's some code, don't sue me. That is probably one of the most permissive licenses out there. And that's great for tooling and code, but what open source licenses create is a trust relationship. They're like, oh, I can use this code or I can modify it. I work in the Apache Software Foundation. Apache version, the Apache licenses has some controls around patents and for trademark and things like that. So it's a little more, but it's still, you can fork it and do whatever you want. And then of course GPL, which is what Linux uses, is like, you know, that's the Free Software Foundation, and it's like if you fork it, you've got to supply, and then you do something, you have to supply the source code for that. So you know, there's these rules around this, but that's all for tooling. But when we're talking about data, no one's going to have an MIT licensed LLM because you can't open source the data that's inside of it, and I know they're trying, but so now we're in this world of the tooling versus the tool. How are we going to live in that world?
Well, maybe, and this is something that Emma was bringing up, maybe we can talk a little bit, I know we're getting into the weeds, but we love weeds, of the actual nuance of what's open, what's not open. But hopefully it doesn't render this next section moot. But how can we leverage these open source projects? So coming back to the end user and the developer that's building upon the LLMs out there, what is the benefit of the open versus the closed, and maybe look into that a little bit.
I think the first one is, as a non-coder, I'm trying to understand your world. I think you're seeking improvement, right, and feedback. And that's one of the important values of leveraging open source projects, right? And unblock new use case from the product perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Like just having people use it more and say, hey, like these things aren't working, right? Because there's like lots of things now that aren't working. I have a whole talk that I'm not going to give today, but a whole talk about things now that aren't working.
Yeah, so I think we have the Kaskada project was originally a startup and we were closed source. And so I think what we saw was that moving to an open source model is so much better for developer adoption. It's so much easier to just pip install a thing and use it than going and setting up an account with your SaaS and giving us your data and whatnot. And so I think that there's a not even like philosophical, there's just like an ease of use benefit of doing an open source, at least as a distribution model, that is just like incredibly powerful. It has been super helpful for us. So.
Well, and the foundation, I mean, with licenses are one thing, but foundations are another. And I think that's a very current topic. HashiCorp just recently said, nope, never mind, Terraform, we got that. So now there's a whole new project, right? They forked the project, the Open Tofu. Love the name. But see, that's the difference between an open source project and then an open source project and a foundation. The foundations give you that assurance to end users. So there's that trust relationship you create there, so that it's the governance. And Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation. Now there's the AI Engineering Foundation. That just happened. But these foundations create this home for the project that now owns the project. And when you're using it, you can feel like, oh, it's not going to get closed source someday, because Mongo, Elastic, HashiCorp, Redis. They all did that, right? They all switched their licenses to something that was non-permissive. And that gives you pause. Anytime you use an open source project, you're like, what's going to happen tomorrow?
I'm sure even more so for the developers that contributed, thinking that they were contributing to something and they were giving it away to everyone, and then all of a sudden that becomes proprietary. Maybe we can talk a little bit about like the development environment for the models themselves, and the benefit of, if you're working on a model, I imagine, and you can tap into the world of contributors without having to pay everybody working on the project, that it's probably accelerates things and lowers the bar a little bit.
I think one of the most amazing thing that's happened in the world of AI over the past, I don't know when this happened, but Hugging Face has just made this incredibly influential service, I think, available. I think that it's equivalent to like what GitHub was for kind of development. And I think what it suggests is that the licensure issues are nice, but what really accelerates the open development process is having the platform to be able to collaborate on. Being able to like have tools that allow you to quickly access the work of others, share the work that you're doing, and have a forum to be able to do that sharing. And that's where I think the real acceleration has been happening in the open AI world.
I would say the efficiency is highly improved, right? Like the coding side, we have Copilot, which I heard is a big thing for the developers now, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, like access in some ways even trumps licensing, right? So, and you talk about, like, for example, like Apache Software Foundation, right? And how, like, there are actually a decent number of Apache projects that are dead, right?
It's called the attic. Yeah.
There's the attic, and there's projects that are not in the attic yet that are going to make it there soon. And so I think accessibility is incredibly important. And I think that's something that also, like, as an open source project and that we all do is like how to like make things easier for new users, new developers, new contributors, because it is quite tough being a contributor. You know, you're doing this in your spare time. You know, you're not getting paid for it. If you are getting paid for it, oftentimes it's like for a specific thing, right? Like we have lots of integrations with people, but it's like, hey, you know, you're really just getting paid to do that integration, and then you have to do something else. You have to do another integration or different piece of functionality. So making that really easy and then also maintainable is an ongoing challenge.
Well, that's where commercial. It's interesting you mentioned like the projects in the ASF that have kind of gone quiet, you know, and you can almost point it directly at it. There's no commercial entity supporting it. You know, besides things like the HTTP server, which is still going strong. I mean, okay, great, that's one. But a lot of it's hard to tell a developer do this for free. You just can't, because everyone's got to feed their kids, you know? And that commercial, and this is an age-old problem. How do you balance commercial, where people get paid and that there's a monetary component to it? Now, Linux Foundation has done a really good job of trying to balance that out. They've been very commercial friendly. Great. Hey, call me in 10 years and see how it went, right? But I acknowledge completely that is something that is really important. And there's kind of an old adage, like if you don't see anyone quitting their day job and creating a startup around an open source project, then you may not want to use it right away.
I want to also, you go ahead, but I also want to open this up to the audience because we want to create an interactive. I shouldn't be the only one here prompting. We've got some brilliant minds up on the stage and want to give everybody an opportunity to share what's up for them around this and ask questions as well as contribute to the conversation.
Yeah. To your point about startups, though, that I think that is a big change that I've seen in my career, right? Like 15, 20 years ago, if you went down to Sand Hill Road, you're like, hey, we're going to do this project. It's going to be open source. Oh, it's going to be MIT licensed. Any company can go and just use the code and do whatever they want with it. You'd be laughed out of the room and be like, what's going on? You have some, mental block about, right?
Making money.
About making money, right? Now, there is a lot more actual support from the venture community to say, hey, this actually does make sense as a business model. You can actually build a business around supporting one or even multiple open source projects and still make money out of it. And
I 100% agree with that, because the open source serves as a foundation, right? As we collect user feedback, we can go beyond next level. So I think by that time you can close that open source project and go to the next level, right?
No, don't close the open source projects. Never close the open source projects. That's like a killer mistake. Don't.
Or tiering.
Yeah, but you can build on top of it, right? And some companies are very successful at building on top of it. But yeah, I mean, this idea, once again, of you have to go closed in order to make money, I think is bad.
Well, these days it's almost the opposite. I think it's the outlier now that's not open. Most of the, we were talking about vector databases, right? Most of the vector databases are open at this point, except Pinecone, right? And I feel like that's probably limiting some of their adoption because I can't run it locally. I have to go create an account. I don't actually know what they're doing behind the scenes. I think that especially in the data space, there's an expectation now that you're going to be open first and then you're going to provide value on top of that, which, yeah, I think that's very new.
Yeah, we kind of broke everybody, didn't we? The past 10 years, but I mean, or some version of it. And, there's interesting models that, the open core, there's an open core summit here in San Francisco, which is really popular. And, that's one thing, and adding business value on top of it with, that's your business model. Of course, everyone's move is SaaS. Hello, I work at DataStax. We sell Cassandra as a service. So of course. But there's a lot of value in that, right? It's finding the value in what that is and creating. I think there's plenty of room to make money there, or we wouldn't be talking about it. If it was just a bunch of hippies writing code. Cool, but that was 1980. This is now 2023, and it is happening. So you just look around. I mean, you work on an open source project, I work on an open source project. They're different models, but it's what's gaining traction. It's still there. And I think Ryan's point is really good. It's like, it's almost weird when you see it's like not open. And yeah.
The mindset, that absolutely changed, right? Yeah.
Questions? Got a hand back there.
Okay, here we go. June, I want to introduce everybody to June Dam, who actually runs an open source meetup. So, love to give him the platform.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, thanks so much for your insights on all the challenges and the kind of the pros and cons of open source. Just switching gears a little bit, I was just curious about what your thoughts are on the capabilities of open source currently versus closed source, and then maybe at the idea of like democratizing AI and the importance of that when we see kind of more and more capabilities and power in these, I guess, AIs that are people think could get to AGI. I'm not so sure about that, but still, just that idea that, you know, hey, democratization, how important is that? Also capabilities. So, any thoughts?
Well, do you think AGI is going to be open sourced?
Does AGI? I think AGI is going to be open sourced.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, code gen right now is causing a crisis with open source projects. And it's, you know, ASF has some very specific guidelines. I mean, they've already published guidelines around code gen. And it has to do with the fact that this data could be potentially copyrighted data, or, you know, we just don't know, right? But then, you know, here's a slippery slope argument. What happens whenever the open source data creates more open source data, like more programs that are based on open source programs? So we're just in this infinite feedback loop. Is it all open at this point? Whoa. I mean, that CodeGen is going to change things.
What are the ASF guidelines for CodeGen?
Well, it's around, specifically, as I understand it, is like, there's just concern about copyrighted code. So it's up to the contributor to make sure that the code is not like copyrighted in some way. So, you know, it's a self-policing thing, but it's pretty clear. It's like, you know, this is hard. It's like basically what they said. It's like, this is hard, and please, you know, be careful. You know, it's really, they're trying to make sure that they're not being a bad actor. You know, it's like we're putting copyrighted code into an open source project by mistake. So, and who knows? I mean, yeah, that means that everyone who uses like a CodeGen tool now has to go like evaluate that code and figure out if it's copyrighted. Whew, that's hard.
Yeah, it's impossible. And like, if you talk to like the younger generations of developers, they're all using CodeGen. Like, I don't think there's a single developer, I think, you know, in their 20s who's not started using some kind of Copilot or something.
That's age bias. I think older.
I'm doing that too.
Yeah.
I have not written a
you're
single
not,
line.
you should start.
The only thing I've written in its original is the prompt.
Oh no.
We have a question here.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so you spoke at the beginning about the code being open, but the data behind it not. I was wondering if you could speak to the model itself. You know, you'd mentioned, you know, nobody's wanting to show their weights off, but I'm referring to how even the folks that build these models, you know, they can't really get good diagnostic information right now. Like, if you ask it, like, why did you pick blue instead of red? Like, the model, like our brain, doesn't, you know, necessarily know why. So I'm curious if you're aware of any projects that are out there right now that are really trying to sort of address openness in the model itself from a diagnostic standpoint, and then maybe setting that as an example for models that want to call themselves quote-unquote open. Thanks.
I was about to say, you just walk through the model that you're proposing, right? Like on this slides, the async time.
Yeah, so I think I mean, Anthropic's doing a lot of really interesting research on like mechanistic interpretability to try to figure out Anthropic.
Oh, yeah.
They're doing a lot of really interesting work. They've got some really cool papers that you can read on their webpage around like building toy models and trying to figure out what they're actually doing to explain like why red versus green or whatever. I suspect we're a long way from being able to actually understand what the model is doing from a diagnostic perspective in any kind of deterministic way, especially with models that are in the billions of parameters. It's just, I would be surprised if that's something that we can be like, oh, look, it lied to me because this active region told it to do so or something like that. Maybe, that would be great. But I think that this is just partially the risk you run with these models, is that you don't know what they're doing, and you...
And in fact, I would go stronger than that. I would say we will never fully understand exactly what's going on with the models, just like we don't fully understand what exactly is going on in your brain.
Yes.
So from the infrastructure perspective, as working with at one of the cloud provider services, we have, I think it's the same as everyone is doing that, right? We're doing the projects trying to improve and do those real-time analysis. So in this way, I think to your question, right, we're trying to analyze the data before we even, we think of ahead. With the AI, we give the prompt and tell the AI that this is what we want, and now you have this data, do what you need. So I think we're having a lot of infrastructure project to support us to get there.
Even your server logs today, do you really understand what your server is doing? I mean, right?
Well, not the cloud. Yeah, it's kind of it's the same cloud problem. It's like when I click a button to spin up an instance, what's behind all that? I don't know. My API works and it's online. We are getting to the point where we're just, it's like our food. We don't know where our food came from.
That's the secret sauce.
If it's
right?
actually food.
Yeah, well, it was like I go to the grocery store and I bought meat. Where did that come from? I don't know. We were conditioned already. I think we've already gone here mentally. We're just doing it with data now.
So this is a little perverse, but I think one of the really interesting things that is an emergent behavior of these LLMs, like I was talking about a little bit, is that they're actually pretty good at evaluating their own results. Like you can say, hey LLM, answer some question for me. And then you can say, hey LLM, is this a good answer? And it'll be like, no, that's terrible. Don't listen to that answer. And so you can actually, people are having good results using LLMs to evaluate the results of their products that are using LLMs to generate the outputs, which is kind of surprising. You wouldn't think that it would be able to turn around and critique itself very effectively, but turns out it can. So I think there's a lot of opportunities diagnostically to at least build some safeguards in place where you're saying please, check your results every once in a while and give me a metric of how much are you bullshitting. But again, these are all kind of in development, and who knows where this is going to end up.
So this is like LLM psychoanalysis?
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me about
Therapist.
Oh, we have another question.
How were you feeling when you told me that?
Hello, Eunice. I'm based in Tokyo, so I was here first, thank you very much for the great discussion. It's actually quite interesting because I spoke at the Linux Foundation Member Summit this week, and it's all about, obviously, it's all about open source. And so my question is really around governance, especially the open source program officer. Not many organizations have the luxury to have an OSPO. So I was just wondering, for tooling, we have these tools around, governance, around scanning, around. So for the models, for AI, for example, how do you see governance? Because we see a lot of times that the open source adoption is developer driven, and then later at some point you have risk compliance join in, and then. And it's the same thing happening for models. So I'm just wondering, because sometimes developers wouldn't care about the weight, about they just want to use the fine-tuned models. So how do you see governance in the space? Thank you.
They're looking at me.
The rules.
Yeah, no, I'm here's the terrifying thing. Governments will create their own, and that's actually that's happening right now, especially with large language models, and this is why open is such a good thing. Where is the data coming from? If a government entity was to create an LLM for use, you should really know what data was used to train on that. And I tell you what, if the U.S. government says we have an LLM for you to use, and we will not tell you how it was made, hell no. I don't want to use that. And that should be the response of everyone and then maybe that just translates to every LLM. Like, where did that data come from?
That is a great question, because I think it's the next presentation we're going to do a presentation about the PII, the compliance and how we actually leverage AI to protect our data. So yeah, stay close.
Yeah, I think there's another level of that as well beyond the actual model itself, which is how are you using data? And so I think the RAG pattern is a really useful tool here, because what you can do is you can apply governance to the augmented data that you're providing to the model. And so you're relying on the foundation model not having information it shouldn't have, and obviously we'd like to improve that. But at least if you're providing it augmented context, you can make sure that you're providing it data that it should have access to. And so you can use the same governance tools that you would use for any other application to the retrieval process. And then you get that for free. So I think it's one of the big benefits of using RAG for anything that involves PII or security concerns or things like that. So
Thank you.
Yep, we got more questions.
Hi, Sheridan Tatsuno. I'm looking at use cases for Gen AI for healthcare and sustainable city planning, more in the use case. I'm not a coder. I'm looking at user side, business models, monetization. So that's the question. Two questions. I look at open source a lot like, I'm using analogy in a bio world, because that's what we look at in urban planning, but like wild fish. And then you have the farmed fish, which is the corporate AI. All right, so the wild fish is just all over the place, and it's hard to track it because there's no area. But however, we have biomarkers now, and so we're able to track wild fish using markers. Today, you can use blockchain to do it very cheaply. On the other hand, I was in the semiconductor industry, so we look at that, and we used ARM licenses their IP. And it's built a major business. So I was just thinking, wouldn't it be easier to use markers, like AI markers, in blockchain to monetize, to identify the sources of all IP, even small code bits, as well as to monetize it? Has anybody doing anything like that, or is that next generation, or is that governance?
No,
I'm looking at monetization mostly.
Well, not for monetization, but and that's probably what GitHub is doing right now. They're going to go down that route with Copilot. But I mentioned Replit earlier. They do code gen, but they're very explicit about their sources. They give you a bill of materials, like this is where we created the data. So you just have knowledge. So it's like, oh, we found this fish in the Atlantic Ocean. Or they'll tell you, no, we totally made this up.
Or they'll make it up and tell you they found it in the Atlantic Ocean.
That might happen too, right? But I mean, right now it's a trust thing.
So I want to thank everybody. Patrick, Yi, Emma, Ryan, thank you very much. This was a great conversation.